The Space Wolves are a chapter of Space Marines known for their barbarism, ferocity, and savagery, and that sure makes them a weird fit for a game like this. Warhammer 40K Space Wolf is a turn-based strategy collectible card game hybrid. It began life in 2014 as a freemium mobile game, and it can still be played that way, but in the years that followed, it saw premium paid releases with most of the microtransactions removed on all of the major consoles and PC. It's that paid version that I finished this past week and I'll be talking about today, but maybe finished is the wrong word. Space Wolf isn't as much a game you beat as it is a game you decide when to walk away. The core of its card collecting and upgrading gameplay loop could in theory be played for hundreds of hours, but I found myself content after a little over 30, which was enough time to experiment with a few of its deck archetypes, dabble very briefly in PvP multiplayer, and most importantly, I beat 3 out of its 4 campaigns, and that felt like an especially appropriate exit point, seeing as how that 4th campaign was a separate purchase that I didn't feel compelled to make, for a variety of reasons. Warhammer 40K Space Wolf has you commanding a squad of 3 Space Wolves at any given time. Each character takes a separate turn, and in each turn you're given 2 action points that can be distributed between movement, attacks, and buffs as you please. The twist is that these actions are governed entirely by Space Wolf's card game elements. Each of the wolves has their own deck of 30 cards, from which a starting hand will be drawn, and 2 additional cards per turn. These cards will fuel every action that can be taken, like moving and shooting. Your primary character has the only deck you will have full direct control to edit. Your partner characters will be given a pre-made deck in accordance to their class, though you do have the ability to nudge that deck into particular directions as they level up, despite not selecting all 30 cards manually. The cards are predominantly weapons, and the key attributes that will vary between these cards are how far they can fire, how hard they'll hit, and whether or not they'll have a unique attack pattern, such as Flamethrower's ability to strike multiple enemies simultaneously. Space Wolf's real standout feature is how it handles resources. Many card games feature some concept of resource management in order to gate powerful cards, whether that be mana, gold, or something else entirely. Hearthstone, for example, has you start each game with 1 mana, and increases that number every turn, thereby allowing you to play cards of increased power the further into the game you are. Space Wolf takes that concept and flips it on its head with its resource, effort. Every card has an effort value assigned to it, and more powerful cards traditionally have higher effort values. But what prevents this from just being mana under a different name is that you don't pay for effort up front. Rather than being a resource you accumulate then spend, effort is a resource you spend then accumulate. Effort determines your spot in line when it comes to turn order. The more effort a character has accrued, the further away their next turn. Meaning there's nothing stopping you from unloading the most powerful card in your hand on turn 1, it's just that you'll incur a longer cooldown period before you can act again. Conversely, this means that low effort turns allow you to perform another turn quicker. Both you and your opponents are beholden to this same system, so if you see the next attacker in line has to recharge 10 more effort before they go, as long as you spend less than 10 effort on your turn, you will take your next turn first, allowing you to potentially double up turns if you play your cards strategically. The relative power and effort required to spend cards must also be weighed against their secondary purpose, movement. The ability to walk along the game's grid isn't an intrinsic capability of your units. Movement is driven entirely through the cards, and while some cards might have movement as their core purpose, any card in your arsenal, weapons included, can be used instead to move. Depending on the context, a powerful rocket launcher may be better served to navigate you away from an encounter, as opposed to blasting your opponents to bits. This system of movement combined with how effort acts as a resource means there's no such thing as a dead draw in Space Wolf. No matter the circumstance and no matter the hand, every character can always do something each turn, and that in and of itself is an interesting twist on card games. Effort being an inversion of traditional card game resource management is a cool and thoughtful way to balance the game, that leads to lots of interesting decision making, as does the game's unique take on movement being fueled by cards. It's clear that serious thought was put into how this game could set itself apart in terms of its mechanics, and that's exactly what makes the rest of the game such a massive disappointment. I didn't like Warhammer 40K Space Wolf, and it's probably not for the reasons that you think. I seldom do negative reviews on the channel for a very simple reason. I only review games that I want to play. I don't review them as they come out. It's self-selection bias, and it's why most of my reviews are positive. I bought them because I thought I would like them. I thought I would like Space Wolf. It checked a lot of boxes for me, and I knew very well going into it what its surface level faults were. I knew it was a mobile game. Production values are low, controls are very clearly transplanted from a touchscreen interface, I can never seem to zoom out as far as I want, sound effects aren't satisfying, story isn't satisfying, and even the $18 US purchase doesn't get you the full game. The real ending is locked behind this $10 sold separately campaign, and getting all of the squad mates and extra modes will run you somewhere in the realm of another $20 on top of that. At that point, we're nearing AAA game prices, despite being nowhere near AAA game production values, all for a freemium mobile game that you paid for. But again, that's not what I want to talk about for this video. Like I said, I knew most of that going in, and was willing to forgive some of those irksome faults if the core gameplay was a satisfying strategic card game experience. But I didn't think it was, and there's a few reasons why. I know it looks like I'm just indefinitely passing my turn over and over, but I can assure you that this is part of a very deliberate and very important ritual. One that I performed in nearly every level, and one that completely shaped all of my strategies. In order to explain what I'm doing, there's two components of Space Wolf that must be understood. First is how enemies spawn. In Space Wolf, there's no concept of the fog of war. You can see the entire battlefield at any given time, and the objective in every mission is some variation of traveling from point A to point B. What you do at point B may vary between destroying a key enemy or standing at a specific spot, but traversal to point B is consistent in every single level. To circumvent the lack of fog of war, enemy units don't actually exist on the battlefield until they supposedly become relevant. So while the battle begins, you may only see 2 to 3 enemies, others will spawn as you travel. Sometimes the trigger for enemies spawning in will be you killing certain other enemies, but the overwhelming majority of the time, their spawn is tied to you walking over a particular set of tiles, simulating an ambush. Over the course of a given mission, you may trigger 4 to 5 unique ambushes that spawn 2 to 3 opponents each at different invisible points along the grid. Okay, so that's our first ingredient. Enemies don't exist until you traverse to certain checkpoints in the level. The second component here is how Space Wolf handles time pressure, or the complete lack thereof. In most other card games, there is an implied time limit based on the pure physical reality of drawing cards. Eventually, you'll run out of cards to draw. In most games, this will incur some sort of game over, but Space Wolf adopts a strategy similar to deck building games like Slay the Spire. Instead of ever reaching the bottom of your deck, it will constantly reshuffle itself so that no cards are ever truly disposed, you'll just draw them again later. There's also no time or turn limit in the game, with the exception of a few very specific levels. And if you're following along, you may see where I'm going with this. This brings us back to that little ritual I was showing you before. Since enemies don't spawn until you move forward, and there's no reason to rush, the optimal strategy in every level is to handle each ambush one at a time, and don't trigger a subsequent one until you've fully replenished. Take out the 2 to 3 opponents right in front of you, then repeatedly pass your turn until you draw your heal cards to heal yourself up, or draw your equipment cards to refuel your ammo. Hell, take this to its extreme but logical conclusion, and you can just indefinitely pass until you've drawn an optimal hand for each of your units, then move forward to trigger the next ambush and repeat the process. It's effectively unlimited mulligans, baked right into the game's rules. You don't need to be a trading card game enthusiast to see the flaw in that. Even if you've only ever played card games with a deck of 52, you'll know that half the fun and half the challenge is quite literally playing with the hand you're dealt. I'm not normally one to optimize the fun out of the games that I play, but this is a strategy game, and for me, the fun in strategy games is developing and uncovering the most efficient strategies, and it's such a shame that the most efficient strategy, in nearly every scenario, is so obvious, ubiquitous, and antithetical to the core of card game design. It's a problem that could have so easily been solved either by imposing some sort of urgency with a turn limit, or, conversely, positive reinforcement with a bonus system in place giving heightened rewards if you finish the battle faster. As it stands now, this optimal tactic allows for randomness to be taken out of the equation almost entirely, and there's no reason to not utilize it at all times. And if there's no randomness, why is this even a card game? That's a question I came back to for other reasons too. Perhaps even more egregious is that Space Wolf's cards are boring. There's rarely anything unlocked that deviates from just being a more powerful version of the cards you had at the start, just different variations on shotguns, snipers, flamethrowers, etc. The game uses an upgrade system as a way of handling opening duplicates from packs. Extra versions of cards can be smushed together to form a more powerful version of that card, and this process can be repeated multiple times. If you ever get stuck, your best bet is usually to grind out earlier levels and upgrade some of the key cards in your deck, rather than trying to develop a new strategy. At no point did I open a card from a pack and feel inspired to craft a deck around it. There's just not enough diversity in what the cards do in order to make that feel like a reasonable or fun idea. And the few times I did switch up my deck were less out of strategic necessity and more out of random experimentation. Even without abusing the aforementioned unlimited mulligans, there's still insane consistency in your draw because of that lack of diversity among cards. Space Wolf imposes a deck building limitation preventing you from putting more than 3 copies of a given card into your deck. This is common in card games to prevent you from flooding your deck with dozens of copies of your best card, which would make your strategy far too reliable. And while Space Wolf does do this in theory, in practice it feels like a pointless limitation for the sole reason that there are so many nearly identical cards. In what I assume is an effort to increase the RPG progression aspects of Space Wolf, most cards have functionally identical brothers and sisters of different rarities that do the exact same thing, just at a different level of strength. In a roundabout way, this circumvents the 3 per deck limitation, as they are technically different cards despite being the same exact card with slightly different power. Again, the downside here is that it simply makes decks too reliable. I almost always found that my player character had the cards he needed at all times because I had so many copies of my best cards in my deck, rarely putting me into difficult situations or tough choices. Why is this a card game? It's a question with an obvious answer, because card games are much easier to throw microtransactions into. Aside from the unique way that Space Wolf handles resource management, the card game half of this strategy card hybrid fails to justify its inclusion, and it drags the strategy half down with it too. I really needed the gameplay here to be good to carry the otherwise low-budget production. If you're here for the IP, there are other Warhammer games that take better advantage of it. Emperor knows there are plenty of turn-based strategy games. Warhammer 40K Space Wolf is a card game where the cards are far less interesting than the framework that they sit in. There are some interesting ideas here, but they get overshadowed by how incongruously they fit together. It's one of the rare games I've played that I think is worse than the sum of its parts, and I'll never not get over the irony of its standout feature being effort.